looking into the theory of evolution and Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. The primary basis for Darwin's hypothesis was contained in the geological theory of uniformitarianism, developed particularly by Hutton and Lyell. This theory argued that the history of the Earth was to be explained in terms of presently observable processes, weathering, sedimentation, etc., operating more or less continuously and uniformly over countless millions of years. By this means, a chronological succession of sedimentary rocks, divided into eras and characterized by distinct sets of fossils, corresponding to the stages of biological evolution, has been postulated. On the bottom are the Archean and Proterozoic rocks, containing virtually no fossilized remains. On top of these rest the rocks of the so-called Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras. The following extract is a typical summary of the alleged animal fossil sequence. Almost all the animal fossils of the Paleozoic are marine invertebrates, such as mollusks and echinoderms. There is also a profusion of trilobites, a very primitive group of arthropods. The rocks near the top of the Paleozoic contain some fossil fishes and a few primitive insects. No mammals or birds are there. In the Mesozoic appeared primitive birds and mammals, but the vertebrate life was represented by the highest development of the reptiles. Some 20 orders of reptilia existed, whose members ranged in size from small birds to huge dinosaurs. The bony fishes became more highly developed and more varied. Most of the invertebrates were very similar to modern forms. Finally, when we come to the Cenozoic rocks, which more nearly approach the present time, we find fossils which closely resemble modern plants and creatures. We find the mammals and birds well developed, but only 5 orders of reptiles are found instead of the 20 that existed in the preceding Mesozoic era. In the first place, it must be remembered that evidence that the fossilized animals once existed does not constitute proof that they evolved either from one another or from some unknown progenitor. In the past, observers explained their origin on the basis of separate creative acts, because this is how they appeared, as distinct groups of plants and animals without the existence of the large number of intermediate forms that may have suggested a connection between them. Evolutionists have made much of the discovery of some fossils, which have been dubbed missing links. But the enormous problem of the fossil record is not missing links, but rather missing chains. Even the so-called primitive animals showed a staggering number of functionally differentiated cells, organs and processes, organized so as to locate and eat suitable food, grow and reproduce. To accomplish the radical changes necessitated by evolution, each of these must undergo a large number of changes, each imperceptibly slight, and of such character as not to disturb the overall harmony of the organism and its equilibrium with the environment, but, indeed, improve its prospects for survival. But the billions of gradually varying life forms connecting the recognized kinds of animals and plants simply do not exist, either in the present biological world or among the fossils. Darwin acknowledged that paleontological evidence for the course of evolution was very meager, comparing it to a history book written in a changing dialect, of which only a few lines of page here and there had been preserved. Each word of the slowly changing language, more or less different in the successive chapters, may represent the forms of life which are entombed in our consecutive formations, and which falsely appear to us to have been abruptly introduced. This problem of the missing chains and the abrupt appearance of new forms still exists. Wimmer, considering the fossils and the assumed geological sequence, observes, there may suddenly appear new groups of animals or plants, which are more highly developed and radically different from the other contemporary forms. A possible explanation for this is the new groups have migrated into new regions. For the geological evidence indicates that at various times in the past the continents were connected by land bridges. Thus the elephants appeared suddenly in Europe at one period and in North America at another. The explanation is that they came from Africa over land bridges, which have since vanished. Thus the hypothesis of gradual transition, opposed by the geological evidence in the case of elephants in more than one continent, has to be propped up by another hypothesis of migration. But where is the evidence of the slow and gradual development of the elephants on the African continent? It doesn't exist. Nowhere is the problem of the missing chains seen more clearly than in the early part of the postulated geological time sequence. Here the development of life forms is required to have occurred not only suddenly, but on a global scale. Consider the following comment. Very few of the groups which we know today were not in existence at the time of the Cambrian period. One of the problems of this Cambrian outburst is the sudden appearance of all of these forms. All of the animal phyla are represented already in the Cambrian period, except two minor soft-bodied phyla, which may have been present without leaving fossil evidence, and the chordates. Even the chordates may have been present, since an object which looks like a fish scale has been discovered in Cambrian rock. It is hardly conceivable that all these forms should have originated in this period. And yet there is no evidence for the existence of many of them prior to the Cambrian period. The whole field of evidence for and against evolution was reviewed in what must surely be one of the most remarkable literary introductions ever produced. Professor W.R. Thompson, director of the Commonwealth Institute of Biological Control, was invited by Everyman's Library publishers to write the introduction to their 1963 edition of Darwin's Origin. His 18-page review, on a purely scientific basis, strongly criticizes and refutes not only Darwin's theories, but those of his modern disciples, and indicates the overall adverse effects evolutionary doctrine has had on scientific integrity and social behavior, with respect to the persistence of the basic types of living forms throughout the geological record from the Paleozoic upwards, and the large gaps between them. He has this to say. On the Darwinian theory, evolution is essentially undirected, being the result of natural selection, acting on small fortuitous variations. The argument specifically implies that nothing is exempt from this evolutionary process. Therefore, the last thing we should expect on Darwinian principles is the persistence of a few common fundamental structural plans. Yet this is what we find. There is often controversy and uncertainty about the definitions of genera, species, and varieties, but taking the taxonomic system as a whole, it appears as an orderly arrangement of clear-cut entities, which are clear-cut because they are separated by gaps. These gaps Darwin explained by the hypothesis that the intermediates are constantly eliminated by natural selection. I do not think we can be expected to accept this unproved supposition as an argument for Darwinism. But in any case it has no bearing on the persistence throughout geological time, in spite of the fortuitous variation and natural selection, on the persistence of the fundamental anatomical plans exhibited by the great groups. But without introducing consideration quite foreign to his system, we cannot explain why the anatomical type of the echinoderm or the insect continued to be inherited. It does appear to me, in the first place, that Darwin in the Origin was not able to produce paleontological evidence sufficient to prove his views, but that the evidence he did produce was adverse to them. And I may note that the position is not notably different today. The modern Darwinian paleontologists are obliged, just like their predecessors and like Darwin, to water down the facts with subsidiary hypotheses which, however plausible, are in the nature of things unverifiable. Thus the record of the fossils to this day is scientifically opposed to the evolutionary theory. Turning to the concept of the apparent evolutionary trend, in the chronological order in which fossils appear in the geological strata, one might be forgiven for assuming, from the dogmatic assertions of many paleontologists and geologists, that they could point to many large and comprehensive sequences of rocks containing their relevant index fossils in an unfailing order, but there is no such evidence. In any one stratigraphic sequence, only relatively few of the supposed geological periods are represented, and the opportunity exists for these to be shuffled into a convenient evolutionary order, in conjunction with strata from other locations. Coupled with this is the additional fact that the ages of virtually all of the sedimentary rock strata have been determined from index fossils that have firstly been arranged in chronological order on the assumption that evolution has occurred. therefore the citing of the geological fossil record as proof that there has been an upward evolutionary trend from more primitive to more advanced life forms is a circular argument which goes no further than quoting an assumption as proof. Since rocks have been dated using the assumed evolutionary fossil sequence, it is not surprising that the fossils often match the declared age of the rocks. But if evolution has not occurred, it would be highly likely that there would be a number of locations where the index fossils were out of order, thereby giving rise to situations where older rocks have apparently been deposited on top of younger rocks. This is, in fact, precisely what we find. In recent years, a growing body of scientific writers opposed to evolution have extricated some of this evidence from the technical journals. Thompson makes reference to the situation as follows. In fact, the strata, and therefore the fossils they contain, do not always occur in the accepted order in some areas of the world. For example, the Cambrian strata, which are regarded as the oldest fossiliferous formations, rest on the Cretaceous, which are regarded as relatively recent in order. Cretaceous or Tertiary beds appear instead of the Cambrian on the granite. Sometimes the character of the deposits would lead to the belief that they were chronologically continuous, since they can be separated only by the fossils they contain. Advocates of evolution have tried to explain away these facts that appear fatal to their system by various hypotheses that involve horizontal thrusting of older strata over the top of younger strata. If thrusting has occurred, we would expect to find clear evidence of the intense mechanical abrasion due to friction and extremely high pressures that would occur at the interface. As well as a lack of such evidence, there is also a lack of a satisfactorily explained mechanism for such large-scale thrusting. H.M. Morris, then professor of civil engineering at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, in his book The Genesis Flood, reviewed the literature on these phenomena and pointed out a number of occurrences where the extent of the out-of-sequence formations and the lack of evidence of abrasion render the thrusting hypothesis incredible and lead to the conclusion that the strata were deposited in the order in which they naturally appear. Some examples are as follows. The Heart Mountain thrust in Wyoming, covering an area of the order of 1,000 square miles consisting of about 50 separate blocks of Paleozoic strata, resting essentially horizontally and conformably on Eocene beds, some 250 million years younger. Morris cites geologist W.G. Pierce. The Heart Mountain thrust has long been structurally perplexing because there are no known structural roots or source from which it could have been derived. Furthermore, there is no known surface fault or fault zone within or adjoining the region from which the thrust sheet could have been derived. The Lewis overthrust in Montana covers an area of 2,000 square miles and is supposed to have been displaced horizontally 35 or 40 miles. The upper layers are allegedly Precambrian, resting on Cretaceous beds nearly 500 million years younger. Yet there is only little evidence of mechanical disturbance at the interface, and plenty of instances where they join at what seems to be a normal bedding plane. The Matterhorn in the Swiss Alps is another classic example of older rocks on top of younger strata, with no logical explanation. There is also the problem of evolution posed by the living fossils, organisms supposedly in existence millions of years ago, of which the presumed intervening geological record bears no trace, and yet which are still living today. The fish known as the coelacanth is probably the best known example. Fossils of this fish are abundant in Paleozoic and Mesozoic strata up to the Cretaceous, after which time, supposedly 70 million years ago, it was assumed to have become extinct. In 1937, a living specimen was caught off the coast of Africa, and several others have been taken since that time. The obvious inference is that the rocks in which these fossils appear were formed in the not too distant past, and that the huge geological time gap is simply non-existent. In the present context, it is relevant to consider the conditions which must exist for organisms to be fossilized. The prime requirement is that of quick and compact burial, so that disintegration by the process of decay and weathering does not occur. Thus catastrophic events such as large floods and volcanic eruptions, rather than condition of uniformitarianism, favor the formation of fossils. The accumulations of fossils found in many places in the world support this catastrophic basis of fossilization. Huge numbers of fossilized fish are found in beds, extending over several square miles, necessitating not only widespread death, but sudden encasement in large volumes of sediment, either simultaneously or very soon afterwards, before decomposition or consumption by scavengers. Dinosaur graveyards have been found in which there were literally scores of skeletons, one on top of another, and interlaced with one another. It would appear that some local catastrophe had overtaken these dinosaurs, so that they all died together and were buried together. Thick coal seams, which are derived from huge quantities of vegetable matter, particularly timber, being excluded from the atmosphere and compressed to a fraction of their original volume, point to the occurrence of enormous floods to uproot and then accumulate such quantities. Not uncommonly, the casts of tree trunks, found in coal deposits, extend vertically through many feet of coal, testifying to the rapid formation of the deposits. Slow accumulation over millions of years would be accompanied by the rotting away of the vegetable matter, and would certainly exclude the possibility of the formation of such fossil trees. A phenomenon that defies explanation on anything but a catastrophic basis is the occurrence of frozen animals in Alaska and Siberia. Millions of animals, including mammoths, sheep, camels, rhinoceroses, bison, oxen, lions and tigers, met sudden death by freezing at temperatures of less than -100 degrees Celsius over millions of square miles of the Earth's surface. D.W. Patton, in the book The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch, remarks, "They perished immediately by asphyxiation because, at these temperatures, their lungs were frozen solid. They dropped immediately, and death ensued very shortly. Death came so quickly that the swallowed vegetation is yet undigested in their stomachs and their mouths. Grasses, bluebells, buttercups, tender sedges and wild beans have been found, yet identifiable and undeteriorated, in their mouths and stomachs." Certainly the evidence is indisputable that the now frozen polar regions once experienced a reasonably warm climate. There is little doubt that the Genesis flood is the agency responsible for the production of the majority of fossils. Not only did it provide the conditions for rapid fossil encasement and compaction in sediments, but it ties in with the general occurrence of fossils in the vertical sequence described previously. Volcanic upheavals, eruption of subterranean waters, stormy floods and gigantic tidal waves are encompassed in Moses' record. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high mountains that were under the whole heaven were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both fowl and cattle and beast and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. The opening of the windows of heaven released the atmospheric water vapor that appears to have extended in a warm blanket over the entire earth. The huge volumes of sediment sweeping into the oceans would firstly entomb the creatures of the seafloor, such as marine shellfish. Fish, being more mobile, would in general be found at higher levels, and reptiles, mammals and birds at even higher elevations for the same reasons. Gregarious animals would suffer death together in large numbers in mass burials. The more intelligent animals, and man, would try to elude the floods, landslides, and tidal waves by escaping to higher ground, and would give rise to fossils at the top of the geological sequence, but in fewer numbers, due to the increased possibilities of disintegration and decay. Obviously in the turmoil there would be numerous variation to this scenario, such as could have produced the geological anomalies that evolutionists have been forced to unconvincingly explain away by overthrusts and the like. In summarizing the evidence of the fossils, it must be concluded that it is antagonistic to the origin of species by organic evolution, but is in harmony with the records of special creation and the flood contained in the Hebrew scriptures. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notifications of new videos. Like, share and comment below.